Living in Virginia, you're in the fast lane on the information superhighway. We've invested $3 billion in Virginia's broadband network to give you one of the fastest internet connection speeds in the world, so you can build relationships, bring new business to our state, and meet the future of education. It's amazing what we can do together. Visit VCTA.com to learn how broadband connects the Commonwealth.
From the General Assembly and the City of Richmond, I'm Woody Evans for Cable Reports, brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and Comcast, connecting Virginians to their government. Let's connect you with Senator Bill Stanley. Good to see you, sir.
Great to see you, Woody.
Delegate Charles Poindexter, how are you?
Good morning, Woody.
Well, I think there's a little issue pending before the General Assembly this year. It involves the budget and whether the Commonwealth of Virginia will conform to the new federal tax code.
Well, the budget, as you know, is always probably the #1 issue, but it is doubly so because of that this year.
And I know you sit on appropriations and you're going to be dealing with these issues. Talk to us a little bit about where things are.
Okay, very good. Here's the issue. The federal tax code has several provisions in it that would result in Virginians paying more taxes. And the intent was to create a better economy, which apparently it is, obviously it is. So Virginians, if they file their federal return and take the standard deduction, that was increased by a huge amount, something like $22,000 on the federal return. So that's going to be tempting to Virginians to do.
Absolutely.
But then when they file their Virginia taxes, our deduction is only like $6,000. So
Wow.
They're going to pay considerable more money. That's the major provision. There are other provisions in it that would result in up to $1.1 billion coming into the Virginia revenue stream. That's one part of the controversy. Well, with that part of the stream, the governor's proposed a budget based on that money. And the second scheme is the forecast of what money we will actually be receiving next year. And the forecast is very good. Our economic indicators are up, people are paying more taxes, more sales tax, and so forth. So that's resulting in almost $1 billion in normal new revenue, which we normally budget to increase the programs because they have different, they increase each year. Cost of running school goes up each year. Cost of running police goes up. So that's the pot that we normally use to do the core services in government. So there's a strong opinion in the General Assembly that on the first pot, the $1.1 billion in increased revenue coming in as a result of the tax cut law, that we want to in some way not spend that and put it in the budget. There are negotiations with the governor ongoing, and we may or may not come to some kind of agreement. Hopefully we will. They're good spirited negotiations. In the meantime, the budget that is being constructed will rely on that $900 to $1 billion in spending. And here's the rub though on that. There is an increase in the cost of the current Medicaid program of over $400 million. The last number I saw was 466. That's mandatory spending. That comes off the top.
That comes off the top.
So out of the billion there, 900 million billion, you've got 466 coming off. And then there are other mandatory programs that we have, much smaller in amounts,
Sure.
you know, 5 million, 10 million, whatever. And so when you subtract the mandatory spending out, we're looking at about 370, 380, maybe $390 million to put on the table to actually increase spending or add new programs, which is not very likely with that amount of money. So the process we're going through now is to construct a budget along those terms And we're hearing the budget amendments and the bills that have fiscal impact to them, legislation that costs money. And we're working through the committee process now, and we're going to come out with something here pretty shortly based on that. That's our approach.
In addition to that unanticipated Medicaid expense, isn't there an additional expense item dealing with the termination of our contract with Northrop Grumman?
Glad you brought that up. That's a second. That's something like 30, 40, maybe $41 million. And our disengagement with VITA, which for the folks back home, that's a contract that we have. That's our agency, but we had a contract with Northrop Grumman to provide IT services across the entire Commonwealth. And we've disengaged from that contract, and we've got to pay some money to get out of the contract, quite frankly. And we have another situation. Another example is Catawba and Piedmont geriatric hospitals. The federal government has told us that we Virginia misinterpreted the federal law and billed them for around $27 million. That is not allowable under the federal code or regulations. So that's an expense that we're going to have to send a check to Washington for $27 million. And then, of course, that increases our cost of operating those two facilities, since we cannot charge the cost off to Washington. So we have to budget some money for that. Those are the two largest items in there, but there are 10 or 15 mandatory places that we actually have to spend more, either by federal code or the existing Virginia code.
Of course, Senator Stanley, you have identified a real crisis in terms of our school construction program. And I know you have some real strong views about that.
I do. We formed a subcommittee. I'm the chairman of local government in the Senate, and this summer we formed a subcommittee that was determined not only just to investigate the issue, but also to come up with solutions to the problems that we found. We visited every corner of Virginia, and no matter what your zip code, no matter what school division we went to, there were maintenance and modernization problems with our public school physical plants. Some of the worst are in the rural areas and the inner cities, and I found out that where I live is a rural area, has a lot in common with the inner cities, and especially, at least in this issue, that they have schools that were built before World War II, World War I, that are still functioning. You've got ceilings that are falling in. You've got some classrooms with only one electrical outlet because the school is so old. You've got mold and mildew issues. You've got, learning, hindrance because of kids are in class and they're taking a test and a ceiling tile falls on their head. What we found is it's a statewide problem. So we put together a package of bills called the Virginia Public School Modernization Act, and it's starting a conversation that says we have to make a priority in our future the modernization of our schools. And what we're seeing right now is, with the school deterioration and it being so widespread, we're talking about a multi-billion-dollar problem that those costs will continue to grow. And the localities don't have the tax base or the capacity of the tax revenues that they generate to fix them. So what they're doing right now is putting Band-Aids on them. The maintenance costs are ever growing, but they're not fixing ultimately the solution. And who suffers? The children suffer. Quite frankly, children are our greatest natural resource here in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And most children attend our public schools. And most children that attend school in Virginia don't go on to college. So when we talk about workforce training and making sure we're delivering a 21st century world-class education, it's got to be in our public schools, and we owe that to those children, because that's going to be the pipeline that's going to bring entrepreneurs here to start businesses, or other companies that are going to come in and hire people that can revitalize the inner cities, that can revitalize the rural areas that have suffered from the economic downturns from NAFTA and CAFTA. So we have to make that a priority, and we've started the conversation today. And one thing that I've brought forward, and we'll see how far it goes, is making us all, delegate and senators, all 140 of us, run on a referendum that asks Virginians, should we make this a priority? Should we acquire bond funding in the billions of dollars that will fix this problem statewide?
And you also raised this as a constitutional concern to the Attorney General.
I did, and I was very disappointed with his answer. I think it was the best political dodge I've ever seen, but I was not trying to set a political trap for him. I asked a very serious question. Are we in Virginia failing in accordance with the Supreme Court rulings of Brown v. Board and Brown v. Board of Education 2, where they said a decrepit school can be a disqualifier and an unequal basis in where education is delivered? And does that apply today? His answer was, it's not a state problem, it's a local problem. And quite frankly, because there are crumbling schools in rural areas, then it's not a discrimination problem. and because those rural areas are predominantly white in certain areas, then it's not discrimination. A complete political dodge, but he also did show a pathway, which concerns me, of where someone can pick up the mantle and sue Virginia for these crumbling schools, and we may be on the hook for $15 billion. So that's why also I think it's a priority that we get around this issue. We overcome the unfortunate comments of our Attorney General. I mean, basically he said it's not my problem, and I guess that's maybe because he's making a statewide run. Very disappointing. I don't care what party you're from. This is not a partisan issue about fixing our schools and taking care of our children. It's a human issue, and I would have hoped that he would have responded accordingly.
Doug Poindexter, back to the budget. I understand one of the fundamental issues involves this earned income tax credit that the governor wants to make fully refundable. Now, Virginia is not one of the states that does that, and obviously that's something that has caused some concern on your side of the aisle. How do you think that issue is going to be worked out?
I don't know if that's going to be worked out at this stage. But the governor's proposing to spend, I think it's $256 million on the earned income tax credit and increase that by that amount of money. But that sort of goes against the tax grain, because the people that would receive that really haven't earned money that's being returned. It is a stipend sent out, a check, if you would, by the Commonwealth of Virginia to these people. As we address that, I would think our posture will be more in the light of increasing the threshold to even file taxes, and through another method, if you would.
Now, on the positive side, I understand there are some additional revenues that were anticipated as a result of a recent Supreme Court decision that allows the state now to tax retail sales over the internet.
Yes, and that there's been a lot of talk about that for several years. The Supreme Court does now, that decision allows us to collect that tax. Unfortunately, the amount of money involved is far, far less than anyone ever predicted in previous years. And one of the reasons is that the major online retailers are already collecting it, and the other was just misestimated. So we're probably not going to have over about $80 million new in the pot as a result of that.
Now, I believe that the governor does have about $80 million for school construction, but that pales in comparison to what you have identified as the real need.
He's put $80 billion into the literary fund, and the literary fund is basically a low-interest loan program for school divisions. The literary fund is obsolete, and it will not, think of it this way, in Halifax, Virginia, their high school is crumbling. They've got to build a brand new high school. The cost of building a new high school is $100 million. $100 million. So they could eat up and not even have, they'd be 20 million short if they were to take that amount. So it's a minimum amount. I appreciate Ralph, Governor Northam, he's a friend of mine, so I call him Ralph. I appreciate his effort, but again, the problem I see, and especially over here in the executive branch and with the Attorney General, is that they do the old shuffle. They go, here's a little money, see we fix the problem, and then they try to have this magic thing where we all forget that the problem exists, that it'll go away, and so they can move along. This continuing to throw a little bit of money at it, do a little bit of fix, and then ignore the problem and watch it get worse is what has gotten us in the first place of why we have a crumbling infrastructure when it comes to our schools. Think about it this way, Woody. We have committed, and I believe that the three pillars of government involve infrastructure, public education, and public safety. We have done bond programs where we have collected billions of dollars to fix our prisons and to build more prisons. And guess what? Recidivism rates are down, crime rates cut almost in half. And the population is half of what it was before we did that. Then we committed, through Bob McDonnell when he was governor, to commit billions of dollars in bonds to transportation infrastructure. And that's worked, and that's helped us in our economy. What's the one thing we haven't dedicated billions of dollars worth of bonds to? Education. And this is the one thing we in the General Assembly can control that should be nonpartisan, which is the physical structures. And so I'm hopeful that, it may take a while to convince some of my fellow legislators, maybe even one right over here. But I'll tell you what, it's worth it, and it's worth for the future generations of Virginians that if we're going to be at the economic forefront, we've got to fix these schools.
Economic development, there was an announcement that's definitely going to help Northern Virginia. I don't know whether it's going to get down the south side or your district, and that relates to Amazon locating a headquarters in Crystal City, Virginia. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I voted for the bill yesterday afternoon. We're moving those bills along sharply in appropriations, and I think Senate Finance's way. It is probably the largest economic development project I've ever been around, certainly in Virginia, and I think it's one of the largest in the United States. So from that perspective, while it's not just a revenue that will come into Virginia, but the point that so many more Virginians will be in colleges and universities obtaining computer science and STEM degrees, and these students can come from anywhere in Virginia, and I'm looking for things. In fact, I have a couple of budget amendments affecting that would look at bringing more of the students into the higher education component of this economic development announcement. That's the rural thing in there for the rural communities. And right now we don't have that many of our students going into that. So it's just it's an awesome deal, and you have to deal with what is. A lot of people will say, well, we should never offer incentives for economic development, but that's reality. That's the way the world works now, so we have to. And the incentives we put into this one really are not going to be paid until after the people are there and working and paying revenue, and it comes later. So that's the first time. We obviously negotiated an outstanding from a negotiation and a posture, because undoubtedly they chose us and we did not have the best incentive package. So from that perspective, I think.
So real estate values are going to skyrocket. They already did once the announcement was made.
They're already up there, and there will be some issues with housing and things like that, and the transportation sector as well. There's some. We're going to spend some. The state's going to spend some money on transportation for transit and so perhaps some highways and things to work the impact for the transportation side of it.
What's going to happen to I-81? You going to get some money for that?
It's not in my district, and the real question is, what's the decision on how you're going to fund? I think the I-81 question is a good analysis for us in our areas to have kind of a gut check. We want Interstate 73. It would connect us to 3 deep water ports and the economy of North Carolina, where they're building roads and their economy's booming because of that. But at the state level, they don't have the stomach for it. We've kind of become regionalistic when it comes to highway and infrastructure issues. And I think what basically we're having a fight here is, so we have 3 options: create a transportation authority, which could raise taxes on the sales tax by half a point, half a cent, and then create their own destiny. But we're really spread out as a region. The second way is to get state money, that is the state to commit to the $2 billion, that's the number I've heard, I don't know if that's right, Charlie, to fix I-81. Well, guess what? Northern Virginia Hampton Roads isn't going to let go of $2 billion worth of road money down through Harrisonburg and in the valley. They're not going to give it to the Shenandoah Valley. So you're left with what's left. Well, you can raise taxes. People in our area, we don't like raising taxes. We like people keeping their own money. And it's even funny because then the people from New Jersey that pay high tax rates are driving down 81, settling in our area, and then voting for higher taxes. But that's another story. But the last option you have is tolls. And so the question is, do we have the stomach for tolls? 60% of the people on I-81 are out-of-staters, transient, they're pass-throughs, but there's still 40% of Virginians that use it every day that might be affected. And when you put tolls on a road, what you're doing is also putting pressure on the side roads, on the feeder roads, and that may have consequences we don't know about. And how long you keep the tolls on there? What's the price of the toll? If you're done with all the road construction improvements, do you yank the tolls off? But I'm telling you right now, it's like a tattoo. You put a toll booth in, it's never coming out.
Sounds like we have a balkanized transportation system, at least in terms of funding. People are fighting for their own interests versus what's good for the entire Commonwealth.
Well, when you go and campaign, well, I'm going to fight for my constituents. That's what happens. I don't know. My view on that is maybe a little. I went through the previous transportation bill. I had my name on it, and I remember how tough it was because everybody had to give, and everybody got a little bit and gave a little bit. It was a combination deal. We might end up with, it's a short session, whether we can get this done this year, to me is iffy, but if we can, I think it'll probably be a combination. Maybe tolls and some sales tax and maybe some gas tax and maybe something else, maybe some recordation tax. But a regional transportation authority through sparsely populated 81 corridor is not equal to Northern Virginia and Hampton Roads, because you don't raise enough money to really get to that $2 billion, anywhere close to that $2 billion. So a lot of stars have to align, a lot of legislators, stakeholders, local governments, everybody's involved in this. So it's going to take quite a meshing, some sausage making, as this phrase goes.
What about the need to improve the salaries of state employees, law enforcement personnel, and school teachers? And of course, school teachers, raising those salaries requires many localities to match that or to do something in that regard. How difficult an issue is that?
Well, the budget, remember, we already have a budget. It has raises for all of those categories in it, okay? So the proposal that's on the table by the governor is to increase the 3% raise to the teachers and support staff in K-12 education by 2% up to 5%. Now, when we looked at the figures the other day in appropriation, and even the last raise we gave to school divisions, a lot of them did not take it because they were unable or unwilling to pay their share. It's roughly 60-40, something along that. So that's already out there, and we still face a problem in both the teachers and the state workforce, especially the state workforce not being on a par with industry. And we have some targeted raises in the budget for that, and we may add, I think we're looking at we're looking at a 1% bonus, trying to keep that money in the budget too, to help along a little bit. We're losing, our state workforce is aging, they're retiring, and we're having trouble hiring people and keeping them past the first 5 years. So and sheriff's compensation and retirement. So we're working hard on that subject.
I know you'll never give up the fight, but where's the end of the tunnel for I-73?
Hopefully, when I leave the governor's mansion, it will be being built. And we'll name a rest stop after you. We'll call it the Woody Rest Stop. And anybody who has a mustache like yours can get free candy and soda. How's that? I mean,
take it.
All right. It's a fight that we have to have. It's a conversation we have to have. You know, we hear a lot of. It's hard to convince Northern Virginia that we have a transportation infrastructure issue or priority that's greater than putting another hot lane in on 495 or 66. And we'll continue to fight that battle. I put bills in every year just so we can remind them that a 90-mile stretch of interstate highway that travels through Southside and Southwest Virginia can create 53,000 jobs, can pay for itself in 9 years and 10 years in the tax revenue it brings, and also connect us to the 21st century global economy and really restore us economically where other things cannot. So this is our best opportunity. I'll keep fighting for it. May not, people said, well, it'll never be built in my lifetime. I'm determined to make sure it's built in our lifetime.
You mentioned the Port of Virginia, and that would be a connection to that port?
Well, 58 actually is a port that connects us to the Port of Virginia. But right now, one of our biggest concerns is North Carolina is building an interstate that will go directly to the Port of Virginia to Raleigh, North Carolina,
really?
State capital. You can better believe that if that's happening, you're going to have a diversion of those containers that may harm our economy in the western parts of the state.
And that's why we need 58 finished. Okay.
Where is that now, by the way?
The money becomes available in July of 2020 as a result of my 2014 bill. So hopefully VDOT will be ready to unload the dozers and start grading up the mountain at that time, because opening 58 up 4-lane all the way to 77 and 81 provides not only a hurricane exit for Hampton Roads, but the connectivity for the Port of Virginia.
That's right.
And that's coming along. I have some concerns that VDOT may not be ready from a contractual view, or they run into a bat or something on a mountain, but it's scheduled to start in 2020. It's related here.
Turning to a little bit more political issues, what about these constitutional amendments? Of course, they've been around for a while to create either a bipartisan or nonpartisan commission to redraw lines every 10 years.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Interesting subject. There's a lot of people that want to do different things as legislation to change the system and change how many terms a governor can send. The constitutional amendment process is intentionally takes some time and some work, and we'll have to pass constitutional amendments this year, And then again, next year, after an intervening election, that same language has to pass again. And then the people get a cut at it in the following November. There are at least two, probably there's maybe another one coming any day, that would set up some kind of commission and that kind of thing.
So we're in court. There's a new order out that will affect the House of Delegates election unless Supreme Court rules otherwise at some point this year. Has the time come for some kind of commission from your perspective?
Well, the first thing is this professor from California has waded in pursuant to an invitation from the Fourth Circuit and has now created modifications in 28 districts. Where I looked over that map. I mean, even the Speaker of the House, a Republican, his district changed 37%.
37%.
In the Democrat direction.
And I understand the chairman of Appropriations District has changed.
In the
quite a bit.
20s. It was clearly a politically slanted map, not done in a manner in which politics was out of it. It just proves the point that, quite frankly, sometimes these commissions don't do a good job because they don't leave the politics at the door. What we're trying to always do is be compact and make sure that communities of the similar concerns are put together. And sometimes you can accomplish that and sometimes you can't. Where Charlie and I come from, our districts, every redistricting gets bigger and bigger because our populations shrink. So what you're seeing now is politics, you know, and don't tell me, I'm a lawyer, don't tell me politics doesn't enter the courtroom. These are political appointments making these decisions as well, these judges. And so I have a real problem with what they've done and where they're going, and it gives me a little more confidence that I believe the House of Delegates, the Speaker being a party, can win his court case in the United States Supreme Court, and they'll throw out this nonsense that we've seen in the federal court just propagated today.
Yeah, the senator's right. It's in the Supreme Court, and what they did makes no sense. So I think there's a high chance that the Fourth Circuit will be overruled in the Supreme Court. But it's also important to note and look at states that have implemented bipartisan commissions. They're as gerrymandered as any other state that does not have a bipartisan commission, because you can't find someone that's totally not partisan. I mean, you might think they are, they may say they are, they may have acted like they're a Republican or a Democrat, but you don't know. And you're putting that ninth person or seventh person as the absolute dictator of legislative districts. And that person is accountable to no one.
Exactly.
As it is, the senator and I are accountable for what we do in the way of redistricting. And we stand before the voters on that. The commission, that key vote on the commission is not. So the people should have a problem with that.
30 seconds.
Well, I'll just add to that. Look, the party that's not in power always wants the nonpartisan redistricting. The Democrats seem to be thinking they're going to be in power after the 2019 election, and suddenly I don't hear them talking about nonpartisan redistricting.
Thank you both for being here. Charles Poindexter, Bill Stanley. Good to see you.
Good to be with you, Willie.
Thank you for watching Cable Reports, brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and Comcast. Until next time, I'm Woody Evans. Mm-hmm.